Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Kai stood at a devastating crossroads, one carved not merely by circumstance, but by the slow erosion of faith, love, and identity. The moment he chose to expose the covert scheme orchestrated by Curtis and Portia, he believed, perhaps naively, that truth was a virtue powerful enough to withstand consequence. He thought his loyalty to Drew, the man who had quite literally given him a second chance at life, would be something honorable in the eyes of the woman he loved. But instead, that decision became the fulcrum of his downfall. Trina, who had once held his hand through the darkest hours, now looked at him with betrayal burning in her eyes. She had expected unconditional support, especially when it came to her family. And Kai, by acting on his conscience instead of her expectations, had unknowingly severed the very lifeline of their love. Her rejection was not cruel or explosive, it was worse. It was cold, surgical, definitive. She told him that she would always choose her family, that he could never be part of it, and that he should leave. No second chances. No space for apology. No room for understanding. The certainty in her words crushed him. In that instant, Kai felt something inside him splinter and die. Not just his relationship, but the deeply held belief that being good, being honest, would protect him. Trina's unwavering gaze had shown him that love could be conditional, that the heart could harden in an instant, and that sometimes, no matter how righteous one's motives may be, the outcome could still be ruin. Port Charles became unbearable. Every street corner held a memory. The park where they first kissed, the hospital lobby where she used to surprise him with coffee, the campus library where they whispered dreams about a future together, each location now mocked him with phantom echoes. The eyes of others, once warm, now carried judgment. Even those who once admired him for surviving his surgery and turning his life around seemed to question his integrity. The betrayal wasn't just between him and Trina anymore. It was bleeding into every crevice of his existence. That was when Drew, sensing Kai's despair, stepped in once again as a guide. He spoke not only as a mentor but as someone who understood what it meant to be cast out, to carry the burden of decisions no one else dared to make. Drew offered Kai a way out, a fresh start in Washington, D.C., an internship that could lead to something greater, a place where his name didn't carry the weight of recent mistakes. He promised that the pain would lessen, that distance could help Kai rediscover purpose, and that D.C. would offer anonymity, opportunity, and healing. Kai agreed, not because he believed the pain would fade, but because he could no longer breathe in Port Charles. The walls were closing in. So he left. With heavy footsteps and a hollow chest, he boarded the train out of town, leaving behind the only woman he had ever loved and the version of himself that had once believed in redemption. In D.C., he tried to rebuild. He woke up each day and dressed in suits, attended meetings, and scribbled down policy ideas. But beneath it all, there was a stillness inside him that felt like rot, a slow decay of idealism. Then, like a shadow stepping into the light, Tracy emerged. She came to him not with threats, but with recognition. She saw the emptiness in his eyes, the way he floated through corridors like a ghost. She offered not sympathy, but something far more dangerous, relevance. Tracy knew of Drew's ambitions, his quiet moves to consolidate influence in both Port Charles and D.C., using loyal allies and former patients like Kai to establish an unseen network of power. She didn't need to convince Kai that Drew was dangerous or misguided. She simply offered him a mirror and let his own wounds do the persuading. Her proposition was clear. If Kai gave her information, detailed, unfiltered, strategic knowledge about Drew's plans, conversations, intentions, then she would reward him. Not with comfort or forgiveness, but with position, prestige, and political power. No more being someone's project. No more living in Drew's shadow. He could be his own man. Tracy would see to that. Kai wrestled with the offer, torn between the ghost of who he had been and the weight of who he had become. Drew had saved him, yes, but Drew had also been the wedge between him and Trina. And in a moment of cruel honesty, Kai realized he no longer believed in anything enough to remain loyal to it. Loyalty had become a liability. Love had become a weapon. If he was going to survive, he needed to stop holding on to things that no longer served him. So he betrayed Drew. It wasn't immediate. It was a slow, calculated descent into espionage. He passed along notes, summaries of calls, updates from strategy sessions. Each one a dagger in Drew's back, each one delivered with a hand that once trembled with conscience but now moved with precision. He told himself it wasn't personal. That this was just politics. But at night, when the world fell silent, the voices in his head were deafening. Tracy, as expected, moved swiftly and ruthlessly. With the information from Kai, she destabilized Drew's network like a master conductor orchestrating a symphony of destruction. Allies disappeared. Support crumbled. Whisper campaigns bloomed into scandal. Drew's carefully woven empire of influence unraveled with terrifying speed. And when the truth of the betrayal surfaced, Drew's response was silence, deafening, soul-splitting silence. No confrontation. No angry words. Just the unmistakable gaze of a man who had seen the sword buried in his spine and recognized the hand that held it. Kai didn't try to explain. What could he say? That pain justified treason. That heartbreak excused sabotage. He stood there in the ashes of what they had built, knowing there was no absolution waiting for him. Drew withdrew from the battlefield quietly, not out of cowardice but out of heartbreak. He no longer had the stomach for a war fought on such treacherous terrain. And Kai, he remained in D.C., a man who had everything and yet nothing. The promises of power rang hollow. The accolades felt like ash on his tongue. He attended briefings, shook hands, gave speeches, but inside, he was desolate. The betrayal had carved out his insides and left behind a man-shaped husk. No amount of career advancement could undo what he had done. Trina never called. She never visited. In time, he heard she was thriving, back to her studies, surrounded by people who had always stood by her. Her laughter, once shared in whispers against his shoulder, now belonged to someone else. And that, more than any punishment, was what haunted him. Tracy got what she wanted. She dismantled Drew's empire and cemented her influence. But she had also created a broken man, one who now understood that the real cost of betrayal is not the trust you lose from others, but the version of yourself you can never recover. Kai had chosen to survive, but in doing so, he had destroyed the very core of who he was. And though the world now called him powerful, he knew the truth. He was just another ghost in a suit, wandering the halls of politics, looking for a soul he would never find again. Kai never returned to Port Charles. The city that had once given him a second chance, at love, at belonging, at purpose, now existed only in his memory, cloaked in shadows and echoes. He remained in Washington, D.C., a city where power pulsed behind every handshake, and ambition hid behind every polite smile. On the surface, he looked like he belonged. He wore tailored suits, held a respected position, moved confidently through corridors of influence. But the truth was far more hollow. Inside, he was emptier than he had ever been, an outline of the man he once hoped to become, now filled with regret, numbness, and a crushing sense of isolation. The days passed in a blur of schedules, briefings, and political theater. He nodded in meetings, took notes, offered insights when asked, and played the part that Tracy had so expertly carved for him. But at night, when the city's neon lights flickered through the windows of his apartment and the silence crept in, Kai was left alone with ghosts. The memory of Trina haunted him like a song that never left his head. Her laughter, once so vibrant, now rang in his mind as a taunt. Her eyes, which once held warmth and hope, now stared at him only in dreams, cold, disappointed, unreachable. He often replayed the day she walked away from him, the finality in her voice when she told him he was no longer part of her world. It had gutted him. But what he never spoke aloud, what he couldn't admit even to himself, was that everything he did afterward, including betraying Drew, had been driven not by ambition, not by logic, but by pain. The pain of losing Trina had unmoored him. It had shattered the core of his beliefs. Love, loyalty, truth, they had all betrayed him in return. In his mind, he convinced himself that if Trina could discard him so easily, then maybe nothing truly mattered. Maybe loyalty was for fools. Maybe it was better to become the manipulator than remain the manipulated. And yet, even as he tried to embrace that cold philosophy, he could not silence the quiet ache within him. Every time he walked past a couple holding hands, every time he saw a moment of tenderness in a public space, he was reminded of what he once had and lost. He had traded love for survival, but survival had turned out to be a cruel master. The halls of political power were not lined with purpose or meaning. They were built on deals, deception, and cold calculations. Kai had learned how to navigate them, but at the cost of his soul. The betrayal of Drew weighed on him as heavily as his heartbreak over Trina. Drew had believed in him. Drew had opened doors when no one else had. And in the end, Kai had stabbed him in the back. Not because he hated him, but because he hated what his own life had become. That betrayal wasn't calculated. It wasn't even rational. It was desperate, emotional, and irreversible. Tracy had manipulated him with promises of control, but she hadn't needed to say much. Kai had already been falling. She had simply shown him a path that looked like power but led only deeper into the void. He told himself Trina would never come looking for him, and she didn't. She moved on. She built a life without him, and rightly so. She would likely never know the truth, that his betrayal of Drew wasn't about strategy or power, but a last, broken response to being cast aside by the only person who ever truly saw him. He had wanted to matter. He had wanted to be someone. But in the end, all he had become was a shadow, someone shaped by grief, anger, and the slow erosion of ideals. Kai still walked the halls of Capitol Hill. His name still appeared on emails, memos, and committee agendas. People shook his hand and respected his insight. But none of them knew the man behind the mask. None of them knew that every compliment felt like a lie, that every success reminded him of everything he had lost. His life had become a performance, and he had forgotten what it felt like to live authentically. He no longer dreamed. He no longer hoped. He existed in a fog of function, drifting further from who he once was with every passing day. And so he stayed. Not out of pride, but because there was nowhere else to go. He could not return to Port Charles, not as the man he had become. He had made choices, some driven by heartbreak, others by weakness, and now he had to live with them. Trina would never know the real reason he turned against Drew, and perhaps that was for the best. She deserved peace, clarity, and a future unburdened by his ruin. As for Kai, he had found his place among the powerful. But in the quietest hours of the night, he still reached for something he could never hold again, a memory, a name, a version of himself that no longer existed. Tracy had won. Not just a political skirmish or a personal vendetta, but something far more sinister and total. She had dismantled Drew's network with chilling precision, exposed his allies, and stripped away the quiet influence he had worked so carefully to cultivate. But her victory was more than just the fall of a rival, it was the transformation of Kai Taylor, once an idealistic young man filled with conviction, into a pawn molded by ambition, heartbreak, and manipulation. In Tracy's eyes, Kai was nothing more than a tool, an asset that had served its purpose. She didn't see a young man teetering on the edge of emotional ruin, nor did she care. To her, he was a name on a ledger, a whisper in the right ear, a convenient weapon to aim and discharge when needed. Once the damage was done, his usefulness expired, she moved on without looking back. But for Kai, every one of Tracy's victories left behind a scar, unseen to others, but etched deeply into the crumbling walls of his conscience. He felt each maneuver she executed using his betrayal as its foundation like a new layer of rot settling into what little remained of his moral core. The quiet applause from her circle, the respectful nods from politicians who admired her cunning, felt to Kai like reminders of how far he had fallen. Once, he had walked into rooms with hope in his chest and ideals guiding his steps. Now, he moved through the halls of power like a ghost, each step echoing hollowly with regret. He had made the choice, he couldn't deny that. No one had forced his hand. But it wasn't power he sought in that moment when he accepted Tracy's offer, it was numbness. After losing Trina and feeling exiled from everything that once gave his life meaning, Kai had mistaken submission for strength. He had believed that aligning with someone like Tracy would help him reclaim a sense of control. But instead, all it did was confirm the terrifying truth that he had nothing left to believe in. His betrayal of Drew wasn't just political treason, it was a surrender of self, an unspoken admission that he no longer saw a future that resembled the dreams he once clung to. Now, each morning began with ritual, the suit, the tie, the agenda. The mirror greeted him with the same face, but it no longer reflected the man he used to be. The idealist was gone. The believer in love, in loyalty, in redemption, extinguished. What remained was a hollow vessel, a man who remembered how it felt to love and trust, but who could no longer summon the courage to feel either. Kai lived, but he did not exist. He participated in conversations, but he did not speak from the heart. He attended functions, but he never truly arrived. Everything had become performative, a tightly orchestrated routine designed to shield the world from the truth, that he was broken beyond repair. He sometimes wondered if Tracy had seen that from the beginning. If she had known that beneath the polished surface, he was vulnerable, soft enough to manipulate, angry enough to abandon his values, and desperate enough to betray the only people who had once believed in him. Maybe that was her true skill, not just outmaneuvering her enemies, but identifying the fractures in others and driving a wedge through them. If so, she had played Kai perfectly. But Kai was not entirely blind to what he had become. In his darkest moments, when the facade cracked and the silence of his apartment became unbearable, he would revisit the exact moment when everything changed, the moment he shook Tracy's hand, the moment he agreed to the plan, the moment he told himself he could live with it. He had believed then that it was a transaction. A necessary evil. But now he understood it was something far worse. That moment had been the funeral of the man he once was. It had been the burial of hope, of innocence, of love. In accepting Tracy's offer, he hadn't just betrayed Drew, he had signed away his soul. He sometimes imagined a different life. One where he walked away from Tracy's proposal, faced Drew with honesty, tried to make amends with Trina. A life where he allowed himself to hurt, to grieve, but not to lose who he was. But those thoughts were fantasies, distant stars in a sky he no longer looked up at. He had chosen his path, and now he walked it alone. No applause. No forgiveness. No peace. And somewhere, in the farthest corner of that vast, unfamiliar city, in a dim apartment above a bustling avenue, Kai Taylor remained, not as the man he once hoped to be, but as a living echo of a love lost, a dream abandoned, and a betrayal that still echoed through the corridors of his own conscience. He was no longer the boy who once believed in justice or the man who once loved without condition. He was something else now, something forged in guilt, defined by regret, and trapped in a world where every choice had a cost, and his had been everything. And so, the story of Kai Taylor settled not into resolution, but into quiet, aching permanence, an ending not marked by redemption or dramatic justice, but by the slow erosion of everything he once believed himself to be. His was not a story of revenge fulfilled or of love reclaimed. It was a tragedy far more intimate, the kind where the enemy is not external but internal, where the battlefield is not lined with bodies but with memories, and where the ultimate loss is not someone else's forgiveness, but one's own sense of self. Tracy had won, strategically, politically, and psychologically. Her fingerprints were on every downfall that followed. She had outmaneuvered Drew, demolished his influence, and reshaped the political landscape in her image. But perhaps her greatest, most insidious victory was Kai himself. In molding him into her instrument, she didn't just dismantle an opponent, she destroyed a believer. A young man once full of conviction, who had survived hardship and clung to hope like a lifeline, was now reduced to a silhouette in a power suit, sharp in appearance but hollow at the core. Kai remained in Washington, D.C., moving with practiced ease through the corridors of influence, but his footsteps echoed with a kind of ghostliness, like someone walking through a world that no longer felt real. The city itself became a maze of mirrors, each reflecting versions of the man he used to be, each one harder to face than the last. The echo of Trina's absence rang louder than any applause he received in his professional sphere. Her rejection, final, cold, absolute, was a wound that never truly healed. It had not only taken her from him but had also shattered his belief in love as a redemptive force. With her went the last piece of the world he could trust. Drew's silence was even more haunting. When the betrayal was uncovered, Drew didn't rage or retaliate. He simply retreated, into himself, into the shadows, into the memory of someone he had once lifted up only to be cast down by him. That silence was deafening to Kai. He had expected condemnation, anger, maybe even vengeance. But Drew gave him nothing. And that void left more damage than fury ever could. It reminded Kai that his actions hadn't just ended a political alliance, they had broken something sacred, the trust between two men who had, at one time, seen each other as lifelines. Now, Kai's days were filled with sterile meetings and performative handshakes. His name appeared in policy drafts, his opinions were sought after, and his career advanced along a track carefully designed by people like Tracy. But no achievement brought peace. There was no joy in accolades, no pride in progress. His nights were restless. He would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted not by nightmares, but by truths. The look on Trina's face the last time she saw him. The moment he realized Drew had been left defenseless. The exact second he agreed to Tracy's terms, thinking he could live with the consequences.